Hello, I'm Anthony Bubalo, Program Director for West Asia at the Lowy Institute. Where countries source their energy supplies is going to increasingly determine decisions in international foreign policy. Energy insecurity, driven by high demand and uncertainty of supply, is set to be a pressing issue for policymakers in coming years. Oil prices are increasing rapidly from US $10 per barrel in 1998 to US $70 plus per barrel today. The world is facing gradually increasing dependence on Middle East oil as global demand, driven by the new economic powers of emerging Asia, increases while supply from other producing parts of the world declines. According to the International Energy Agency, global oil demand will grow from the 83.6 million barrels per day produced in 2005 to 116.3 million barrels per day by 2030. Most of this increase in demand is forecast to come from developing countries, and in particular from Asia, where China and India between them expect to provide 11.5 million barrels of the 33 million barrels per day increase, or more than 1/3 of the rise. Energy security has become a real concern for international policymakers. When oil prices increase, inflation tends to rise and economic activity tends to fall. However, globalization has delivered a low inflation environment, and advanced economies are more service-driven and less oil-dependent. So world economic growth has remained resilient and inflation quiescent so far. Growing world demand means that nearly everyone will be importing more oil in the future, both in absolute terms and as a share of their total oil consumption. This increase in oil import dependence will be sharpest in developing Asia, where China, for example, will see its import dependence increase from 46% of net consumption in 2004 to a forecast 77% by 2030. The supply response to this increase in demand will be dominated by a small number of big producers where proven oil reserves are concentrated. According to estimates in the Oil and Gas Journal, the world's proven reserves of oil amounted to 1,293 billion barrels at the end of 2005. Together, the Middle East and North Africa accounted for 62% of that total, and Saudi Arabia alone accounted for a fifth. Production in OPEC countries, particularly in the Middle East, is forecast to become increasingly more important in world supply, reflecting both higher reserves and lower production costs. The IEA, for example, expects the share of Middle East OPEC production in world supply to rise from about 25% in 2005 to more than 40% by 2030. By contrast, conventional crude oil production from non-OPEC suppliers is forecast to peak by the middle of the next decade and then to decline. Growing energy demand from Asia and growing reliance on the Middle East will have strategic consequences, three in particular. Firstly, as reliance on the Middle East grows, energy consumers become more exposed to the region's political and military volatility, to the continuing fallout in Iraq, and to ongoing US and Iranian tensions. Secondly, China's growing reliance on imported oil has spurred it to seek equity stakes in oil fields all around the world, but in particular in the Middle East and Africa. This has in turn sparked a competition for equity and influence with other oil-reliant states like Japan. Currently, Japanese companies have an equity stake in about 15% of the oil Japan imports, but a new energy strategy plans to increase this to 40% by 2030. Thirdly, China has already aggravated the US over its burgeoning energy ties with long-time pariah states Sudan and Iran. As Chinese energy diplomacy in the Middle East grows, there is a risk that China will be seen by the US as a strategic competitor, and this in a region within which the US has long seen itself as predominant. In turn, this will feed into any global rivalry between the US and an emerging China.